The goal over my entire channel is to help you make music as soon as possible, and I hope you're getting a lot of value from these videos, but I wanted to make this video today to share with you 13 things that you need to be doing before you hit record in Presonus Studio One. As musicians, we're always eager to jump in and start recording as soon as possible, but there are several things on this list that if you're not doing this, you're gonna be having headaches and frustrations later on in the process. So buckle up, grab some popcorn, let's jump into 13 things you need to be doing before you hit record in Presonus Studio One. Now on screen, you're gonna see the homepage for Presonus Studio One. I trust that you've already installed the software on your computer. If you haven't installed Presonus Studio One and you have no idea what I'm even talking about, check out this video that's on my channel about recommended installations for Presonus Studio One. I'll go over with you everything that you need to install the program and then your first time opening up as well. But when you open up Presonus Studio One, you're gonna see this homepage, and quite fitting for today, I've opened up Presonus Studio One, and at the top of the screen, I can see there is a new version of Studio One available, update now. I am the type person where every time I see an update, a software update, an operating system update, especially as being like a Mac user at heart, every time I see an update, it really makes me nervous because if I've got a good thing going, why do I need to update all the time? Presonus is pretty good about their updates. I don't remember a time where I've updated and then regretted it, okay? Especially keeping up with what's happening in the software. Anytime you see this at the top of the screen, provided you've got some time. If you're working on a project and you really need to get that project, you're in a time crunch, don't worry about updating right away. But if you've got a few extra hours or you're about to leave your office for the day, go ahead and click update now. It really doesn't take that long usually. So I'm gonna click update. As you can see, the software update is about 260 megabytes. Shouldn't take long for your internet to download. And of course, once it downloads, you're probably gonna have to restart Presonus Studio One. All right, now that it's been updated, I'm back at the home page, and as you can see at the top of the screen, we don't have any new updates available. If you haven't seen the updates tab at the bottom of the page, you can just click check for updates, and as you can see, I'm running Presonus version 6.5.2, and this is the professional version just in case you're wondering, but it looks like we're all up to date. The next thing you need to do, other than check for updates, is go up to where it says Studio One and then Studio One installation. So the installation process, as I mentioned in another video, this is where we're installing all of the stuff that Presonus has to offer. So you can just run with the bare bones minimum on Presonus Studio One, but of course, as you can see my installed content, there's a few things I want to recommend. For sure, it's the artist instrument library. This is going to include things like Presence, that's going to have synthesizers, strings, a bunch of virtual instruments that are going to come in handy. There's going to be times where you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, this isn't like the highest quality piano sound out there, but the artist library that's from Presonus Studio One, it does a great job and it comes in handy, especially in a pinch. Sometimes for random reasons, I might need the sound of brass or a saxophone. Well, I'm not the type person to spend a lot of money on a third-party instrument of brass. I would just use the built-in sounds from Presonus Studio One. As you scroll down, the Impact drum kits, those of you that are into recording loops and electronic drum sounds, Impact drum kits doesn't have a lot of like real or acoustic sounding drums, and that's perfect for me because I do have a real drum set in this room that I record with microphones. The Impact drums kit comes in handy when I need things that are really fake sounding, like disco claps or an 808 sound. Download the Impact drum kits. There's a few other things, the loop libraries. If you're somebody that works in podcast or you do YouTube videos like this, you may want to make use of the loop libraries. These are like pre-recorded loops that they have in Presonus Studio One. About the only ones that I don't download out of the installation section is the documentation. These are like manuals and stuff in like French and German, whatever. And then the demos. Demos are things like you're watching here on YouTube already. If you scour the internet, you're going to find demos and tutorials. Usually those don't come in handy for me. And then of course at the bottom of the page, you have the install options, okay? This is on my home desktop PC. I do use an external SSD specifically with my MacBook, but my MacBook and my laptop stuff has a separate installation of Presonus Studio One. I don't mean that to confuse anyone. If you're using a desktop tower that has built-in storage, this one has multiple solid state drives inside of it already. So all of my stuff is being downloaded from my Presonus account and it's being installed to my documents folder where I have Studio One. The important thing is that when you're opening up Studio One, before you open up a session, you need to make sure that your software is up to date and that you have all of your virtual instruments figured out. You've already got them downloaded, ready to go, because if you have to install a virtual instrument after you've already had a session open, you will have to close out of that session and restart Studio One for that virtual instrument to take effect. So we want to do that right from the get-go before we open up a session. All right, the next one, we need to check our audio interface settings. So under this Setup tab, still on the home page, you should see your audio interface. I'm using a RME Babyface Pro. This is a 2-channel USB interface. If I click where it says Fireface USB, you should be brought to the audio setup screen. And here you can see under audio device, you have a selection of audio interfaces. Yours is most likely going to look very different than mine. If you have one of the Presonus Audio Box USB interfaces or the Focusrite Scarlett, your interface, if it's plugged in and working well, if it's on, it should show up on this list. If you don't see it, exit out of Studio One, make sure you've downloaded all the drivers and software that comes with your audio interface so that it shows up. If it's not showing up here, it's not going to do you any good when you start opening up a new session in Presonus Studio One, because you're not going to be able to record anything if your audio interface isn't selected. So this is like the brains of Studio One. I'm telling it I want it to use the Fireface USB, and then I'm going to click OK. Stuff like sample rate, we'll get to that in just a second. You can change a lot of those things later on. The other thing is your external devices. This would include like your MIDI keyboards. If you have one of those USB keyboards or you've got a synthesizer, anything that's being plugged in via USB that's not your audio interface, you might want to go ahead and add those under external devices. So I do have a video, I don't mean to keep throwing this stuff out, but there's a video on my channel already about setting up MIDI in Presonus Studio One. Essentially go to your external devices tab, click add, and most of the time it's going to be under new keyboard, okay? Under new keyboard, you can change the name of the manufacturer to whatever you want it to be. It can be a Casio, and then device name is Privia. That's my wife's weighted keyboard we have in the other room. And then the receive from, when you click this drop-down menu, you should be able to see your USB device. Like it will say Casio Privia, or it will say M Audio if you're using one of those MIDI cables or whatever. This is not the same usually as your audio interface. So that's going to be plugged into a separate USB port. Just make sure it's receiving from your MIDI keyboard. And then sending to, if you're using sounds from your keyboard, you need to make sure that your receive from and your send to are the same device. Once that's all set up, you can click OK, and you should have your instrument there. Now we're ready to start creating our session. So the very next thing, we need to name our session. I go up to here. All right, so next on the list, we need to add a new song. So at the top left of the screen where it says new, click this button here. It's going to ask us, what do we want to name our song? I highly recommend that you name your song. Don't leave it blank. Don't let it just fill in automatically like random digits. Give your song a name, even if you need to name it something like Bluebird, Green Fish, like give it some sort of name, because you will associate that session with something. If you're recording a bunch of tracks all at once, even if you're just coming up with a song idea and you don't have lyrics just yet, make up something, because you'll start to associate that song with that word, and then you can always rename it later. But for now, I'm going to call this one Bluebird, and it's going to ask me right below the song title, where do I want to save this song? So I've got some SSDs, like I mentioned earlier, in my songs SSD. This would be an external drive that I have on my computer. If you're somebody that has to travel, if you're going to be mixing your song on a laptop, or if you're going to be in a car, or you're going to work and you want to work on your session, of course you need to install it. Your song session needs to be installed to an external SSD. This is basically going to be where all of your audio tracks, if I'm recording guitar, if I'm recording a vocal, anytime I hit record, it's recording an audio file to whatever folder I tell it to. So I'm going to tell it to record my song session on an external drive. As I mentioned earlier, I'm in a kind of complicated setup. I have my home PC desktop that I have here in the room. It's running Windows. And then I have a MacBook Pro that has Presonus Studio One as well. They are both running the same versions of Studio One version 6. As long as they're both up to date with the latest version of the software, I should be able to transfer my song session from one laptop to the desktop and back and forth. Doesn't happen all the time, but if I want to record something like a real life piano or real life drum set, I'll go to my church. I will move the session to my laptop temporarily. I'll record drums and I'll move things back to my Windows computer. 9 out of 10 times this won't affect you. You'll probably want to save to your documents folder on whatever your main drive is. But make sure you've got a clear path set up so that you know where your session is being saved. Next thing is the sample rate. Most of you out there probably just need to be recording at 48 kilohertz. If you're using something like the Focusrite Scarlett or the Presonus Audio Box, some of the more affordable audio interfaces, they can record at 96 kilohertz, but just know that not all sample rates are created equal. If you're a person that uses cameras, we know that there are cameras and TVs out there that say they record in 4K. And of course it'll be 4K, but not all 4K is created equal. So just because it says it can run at 192 kilohertz doesn't mean you have to record at that sample rate. I've got an RME Babyface Pro. I could easily be recording at 96 kilohertz if I want to, but for most of the purposes, me making YouTube videos like this or doing a scratch song at home, I just stick to 48 kilohertz. So 48 kilohertz is gonna have a smaller file size. Yeah, it may not technically have as much detail as 96 kilohertz, but it's gonna save me a lot of headaches in the long run if I just go with 48K. After that, I'm just gonna click OK. As soon as I click OK, it is now opening a brand new session in Presonus Studio One. All right, before we move on, a quick shout out for the channel. If you're brand new to this and this is just not making sense to you at all, I've got a bunch of videos linked in the description of this video that I've already done on this channel. Things like I've mentioned, how to install the software, how to get MIDI keyboards up and running, and how to record your first song in Presonus Studio One. I try to be as lengthy and detailed as possible because I know some of these videos can just fly over your head if you're a beginner. Also reach out in the comment section if you have a question about Studio One or any of the things I've been talking about in my videos. I do my best to respond to as many of them as possible. I don't work for Studio One. I'm not sponsored by Presonus. I'm not a customer support person, but I do want to help you out. So feel free to hit the subscribe, like button, and drop a comment if you have any questions. Now let's move on with the rest of the video. So this wouldn't technically count as a step, but we need to go over kind of the overview and the layout of what you're seeing on the screen. So when I open up Presonus Studio One, the first thing I'm noticing at the bottom right, you're going to see a Browse, Mix, and an Edit tab. The Browse tab is by default going to be open on your screen. If you want it closed, simply just click the Browse button. But within the Browse tab, you have shortcuts to different things like Instruments, Effects, Loops, Files, the Cloud, Shop, and Pool. Instruments are going to be like what I was talking about earlier, virtual instruments that are coming from your computer. So if you have a fake brass or a fake drum set sound, you can click the Instruments tab and you'll see things like I was talking about earlier, the Impact drum kit from Presonus. Presence is good for, like I was talking about, strings, any sort of keyboard type things. All you would do is drag and drop the instruments onto your song. It'll create a new track. And then within this virtual instrument, you can click a drop down menu and you have all these presets. So if I want to go to a Detroit kit, I can load a Detroit kit and I can hit any of these samples. And I can record music that way if I want to, okay? The other one is Presence from Presonus Studio One. If I click the drop-down menu for this, like I was talking about earlier, brass is not something that I play in this room. So if I needed brass, I could go to French horn full. As soon as I do, I can click any of the keys down here, or I can use my MIDI keyboard to activate a French horn sound. How fun is that? Okay, so all right, after the instruments, you're gonna have the effects tab. This is gonna be your plugins folder. You may not have all the plugins that I have on my machine. I've spent some money on things like FabFilter and UAD to have some different plugins. You should have the Presonus folder though, for sure. Presonus folder has got different things that simulate like amplifiers, can simulate guitar pedals and effects and amps. You're gonna have compressor plugins, de-essers, the Fat channel, definitely check that out if you haven't already. You're gonna have EQ. I recently did a video on the top 10 stock plugins in Presonus Studio One. So all of these plugins here, I believe there's like 42 of them from Presonus. I've done a video on the top 10, kind of introducing you to those. You can check that out later. But these are your plugins. Your plugins are gonna be added to your tracks. We'll get to that a little bit later. The loops category, like I was saying earlier, if you're doing podcast or you're doing some background music and you're just looking for some inspiration, look through the different loops. You have them situated by instruments. You can go through different instruments. You can make them styles. So if you're looking for an EDM loop that is animated and bass, you can click and drag this onto your song and you'll have a nice bass loop. Let's see what this sounds like. So maybe you want to use that. It's got all sorts of things. It's got people singing certain lines, choirs, all that kind of stuff. That's the loops folder. Files are essentially like the Finder or the Windows Explorer that you're used to using. You can cycle through your documents. I typically don't use this. I'll just have Windows Explorer open. You can still drag and drop stuff in. The cloud, I don't really use the cloud, but if you're looking to upload things straight to SoundCloud or Studio One Plus, you could make use of that. There's the shop if you want to buy some more stuff from Presonus Studio One. The pool tab is where all of our audio tracks are going to be recorded to. So even if you hit the delete key on your session, if you're looking for something that was previously a part of your session, you can find it here. So we just deleted the bass loop that we dragged in, but in the pool tab, it's already got it right here. So if I want to restore that same bass loop, I can go to the pool tab and find it right there. So if you're recording someone's vocal, you accidentally hit the delete key, open up the browse tab and go to where it says pool. You should be able to find that audio track there. So that's the browse tab. Mix tab, this is going to be familiar to you if you're somebody that's used a console in the past. 9 times out of 10, you're going to be on the mix tab at some point. And I like how it's split the screen like this. But one of the things you might need to do is find this little section right above the mix tab. You'll see it turn into 2 arrows. I want to click and drag this up so that I have more vertical space to look, because there are inserts and there are sends. And here we have all of our tracks laid out for us. As you start adding audio tracks and buses in the future, this will be a great section for you to go to. You can move these faders around to make stuff quieter or louder, and you can also pan things left and right. On the left side of the mix tab, there is this vertical bar of menu items. You can use this to change the way that stuff looks. So if yours doesn't look exactly like mine, just look through and see if any of these tabs are open. If it looks really condensed like this, you might have accidentally clicked the left and right pointing triangles. You need to expand that out. This tab here is our inputs. So on our audio interface, if we have any of our tracks enabled, you'll be able to see meters coming in, the input for your audio interface. Then we also have an output tab. I don't have anything selected there. We have our instruments tab, external devices tab. We have our virtual instruments tab. I'll close that. As you can see, it's got impact and presence there. I'll close that out as well. I can open up this one where we have some scenes and recalling certain functions. So if you have a certain mix and you want to save it to a scene, just like you would on a Behringer X32 in a live situation, you can use that. Next, you have a tab for your groups. That mainly be for if you're like recording drums, you might create your own groups later on. And then this last one is your channels list. I don't find this one super useful, so I want to close that as soon as possible just to get that out of the way. Then you've got your things for settings, your inputs and outputs can be accessed here. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then, of course, on the far right, you have your main output fader. So everything you record has got to come out of your main output. Your entire mix will shuffle through this at some point. This will control your overall output volume. You can use this main fader if things are a little too loud. So that's the mix tab. The edit tab, again, if you're just getting started off, I usually will not be using the edit tab that much because a lot of the edit functions you can do up in the timeline. So close out the edit tab. Most of the time, I'm just having the mix window open at the bottom of the screen. Then on the left side of the screen, you have these icons at the top left. Again, we have a tracks list. You can close that out, but if you've hidden tracks or you can't find certain tracks, use the tracks list tab. At the top left, you also have the inspector view. I love the inspector view because it gives me essentially a close look at the mixer, but whereas the mixer takes up so much space horizontally, the inspector tab gives me a single channel's worth of information. So whatever channel you have selected, as you can see on the inspector tab, the information will change. You can add plugins, effects, all that sort of stuff that you would normally do on the mix tab. You can access it on the inspector view as well. All right, then you've got a section for your settings and automation. We'll get to automation much later, probably in a separate video. And then over here next to your add tracks button, you have these little burger stacks. If you click those, you'll have access to the ruler, to the marker, to chords, to the arranger. You can keep adding these as much as possible. So if you don't see any of these things at all represented, just see if they're checked or unchecked at the top left. So if you don't want any of those to be visible, just uncheck them from the little burger stack. We'll get to several of those things like the arranger and the marker tool in just a minute. All right, so here we've got a brand new session in Presonus Studio One. The first thing I want you to do is add your tracks, if possible, into Presonus Studio One. To add tracks, you can either hit T on your keyboard or click this plus button at the top of the screen. It'll ask you if you want to add an audio, an instrument, an automation, or a folder. Audio, 9 times out of 10, is what you're going to be using. Anything that you're recording in real life outside of your computer is known as an audio track. So if I want to record electric guitar, acoustic guitar, my drums here in this room, those are all audio tracks. If I go to instrument, those are sounds that are coming specifically from the computer, not coming from me here in the room. So if you're recording virtual instruments from your computer, that's under the instruments tab. But things like acoustic guitar, bass guitar, and so forth, that's from the audio tab. So the first thing it's going to ask me is, what do you want to label this track? The track name is going to be acoustic. We can say acoustic guitar, add as much information as you want. It's going to ask you, how many acoustic guitar tracks do you want to add? I'm going to go ahead and add 2 of them. And then the color, I want my acoustic guitar tracks to be yellow. Format, do you want them to be mono or stereo? Most of you out there, it's going to be one or the other. Most of the time I'm recording mono. Even when I have a stereo pair of microphones, I will still record both of them individually. So just keep it on mono. I don't want to have any sort of preset chain. It's going to ask me for what sort of input I want to have. Most of you out there have a 2-channel audio interface. It'll ask you, do you want to use input left or input right? So it'll say that your first channel on the left is going to be your acoustic guitar. You would click the first one that shows up there, and your output is to the main. So I click OK. I now have 2 acoustic guitar tracks. If you can't read all of the labels, put your mouse over here on the left, drag this out a little bit, and you should be able to see both of the names there. As you can see, acoustic guitar 1 and acoustic guitar 2 are coming through my first microphone channel here. If you click any of these inputs underneath the name of the track, you can go to audio input and output setup. So I want to show you real quick how you can set this up. So I'm going to actually delete these tracks here, and we're going to start from scratch. So here I have no inputs right now on my audio interface. First thing I want to do is account for my first and second input. So on my Fireface USB where it says inputs, I'm going to add a mono track. As soon as I do, it says input 1, and input 1 is going to analog 1, which is my RME Babyface Pro first channel. If I click add mono, it'll add an input 2, and then it automatically adds it in a diagonal form. So if I look from left to right, I have input 2, it's going to the second input, which is analog 2 on my RME. I can click add mono because my RME Babyface Pro has 2 microphone inputs and 2 instrument inputs. And then I have a second audio interface for when I record drums that has 8 inputs. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, instead of it saying input 1 and so forth, I actually like to name these based off of what the microphones I already have plugged in. So input 1 is my TLM 103. Input 2 is usually my electric guitar DI box. This will be my guitar 1, guitar 2. Simply type in the title of the track and then hit the tab key. Now I have my inputs for my Sapphire Pro 40. So I believe, just going off the top of my head, we have hi-hat on the first channel of the Sapphire Pro 40. Then we have the ride cymbal. Then we do kick, snare, tom 1, tom 2. And then the last 2 channels on my Sapphire Pro 40 are actually used for doing these videos on YouTube. So I'm going to leave those as input 11 and input 12. As soon as I'm done labeling my inputs and outputs, I just hit the apply button. As soon as that's done, I can look over at the outputs. And for my situation, your situation most likely as well, We don't really mess with the outputs because if you have an audio interface with multiple outputs, like you're running multiple sets of speakers, multiple sets of headphone mixes, you'll of course need to add some stereo tracks to this so that you've got all of that situated. For me, I just use the main output on my RME Babyface Pro because it's just me by myself. So I click OK. Now I've got everything labeled. If you need to change the inputs of any of your tracks, just make sure you have that track selected. So if I recorded acoustic guitar with this microphone directly to my left, I would just make sure that I have the TLM 103 channel 1 selected for acoustic guitar 1 and 2. Now I'm going to add the rest of the audio tracks, and the audio tracks I'm going to add are actually ones that I would just think of in a traditional like rock band situation. So I'm going to do things with the T button on my keyboard. I'm going to hit T. I'm going to say after the acoustic guitar, I'm going to say bass guitar. I'm going to add 2 of them. I'm going to label them blue. They're going to come in through my channel 2. And bass guitar 2 is actually going to be bass amp. Bass guitar 1, we'll call this one bass DI. So my bass DI will come in through channel 2, and then my bass amp I'll record with the kick drum mic at some point. All right, so now I've got acoustic guitars and bass tracks. I'm going to go ahead and keep adding my audio tracks until I have the session built out. We'll fast forward through this part. So I've got all my audio tracks added onto the session, but I want it to look a lot cleaner, and that's where we use pack folders. So if you select any of these audio tracks, you can scroll up and down. As you can see at the top, I've got my acoustic guitars. If I click the first acoustic guitar, hold Shift, click the second acoustic guitar. With both of them selected, I can right click and I can go to what's called pack folder. When I pack a folder, I now have a folder where when you expand the folder, visually you're able to see both the acoustic guitars. I can rename this folder Acoustics. Click enter. Now I'm going to do the same thing with all these others. So I'm going to select both of my bass guitar tracks, and I'm going to call this one bass. Whoops. Call this one bass. Then we have our electric guitars. I'm gonna have all my background vocals packed into a folder. BKGVs. And then all my drums that are red, I'm gonna pack those into a folder as well. I'll call these drums. So visually now it's a lot easier to look at. I've got 6 different folders or tracks, and I've got these where I can expand them out. Now, having a folder is not gonna affect the sound. We've not grouped these together, and there's not a way to add plugins to folders. That's where buses are going to come in handy later on. If you don't like the color that you've selected, like for this drums folder here, it's a little bit pink. I can click where it has the color. It'll open up the color palette. I can then change it to whatever color I want. If I want my vocal to be a different color, I can select here and let's look for another color. Let's go with white. Same with electric guitars, basses. And then if you want to rearrange the order of them, I can click and drag the drums, put them up top. After drums, I can have bass, and go electric, acoustic, vocals. If I want to move vocals up to the top, I can hold Shift. So that's a lot nicer to look at than just looking at a bunch of 50 different tracks. You can also change the size of these tracks down here where it's got a little hamburger stack next to your horizontal scroll. You can click and drag this up to make them larger vertically, or you can drag it down to make them very, very small. Okay, so if any of the information, like the inputs and stuff, if that's hidden from you, just make sure it's more visible like that. So the next thing before we start recording is to add buses for these channels. So if I open up the Mix tab, I've got all of these channels right here splayed out. And as you can see, the output for all of these channels is going to the main bus. I want them to make pit stops along the way. So I'm gonna show you with the drums real quick. So I've got from my kick drum all the way to my room mic. If I select all of these tracks by holding the Shift key and clicking from left to right, I can right click and I can say add bus for selected channels. As soon as I do, right before the main bus, we now have what's called bus 1. If I double click here, I can rename this drums. So now, instead of my kick drum going straight to the main output, it's making a pit stop along the way. It's going from the kick drum track, it's going to the drums bus that I can process, and then from the drums bus, it's going to the main output. You can do the same thing with your other tracks as well. If I select all these bass guitar tracks, add bus for selected channels, now I've got a bass bus. On my guitars, I don't have to have just an electric guitar and an acoustic guitar track. I can select all of my guitars, acoustic and electric, add bus for selected channels, and I can call this one guitars. From there, let's see the other ones that had vocals. So I'll take the lead vocal and all the background vocals. I'll put those into a bus. I'll call this one vocals. And then from your buses, you can create buses on top of buses. Every single one of these buses, you can add inserts like Presonus. You can go through, add plugins and stuff as you wish, so that every step of the process, they're getting a little bit more processing before they get to the main output. From these buses, I can select all of them here, add bus for selected channels, and I can call this one my mix bus. So as you can see, the output from my drums tracks are going to drums bus. From the drums bus, they're going to my mix bus. And then from the mix bus is going out the main output. So if I did something like if I took the guitar bus and I turned down this fader, all of my guitar tracks are going to be turned down in volume. And then my bass guitar, I can turn that down. Drums, I can turn them down a lot. And then my mix fader, I can move this down. If I move the mix fader down, I'm turning down my drums, bass, guitars, and vocals all together, okay? So buses allow you to process things independently. The other thing you can add are what's called effects tracks. So if I add an effects channel, that would be things like reverb and delay. I can rename this reverb. And then my reverb track, I want to output to a bus specifically called effects. In my effects track, I want this to output to my mix folder. So on your reverb or your effects tracks, you can add certain plugins like room reverb, for instance, from Presonus. So now anytime I want to send something to a reverb, I can select these acoustic guitars. Underneath sends, I can select reverb. So now my acoustic guitars are going to be sent, a signal is going to be sent to my reverb effects track. And from my reverb effects track, I can manipulate that reverb how much I want. And then that's going to go to my mix bus. My mix bus contains all of my buses, drums, bass, guitars, vocals, and it contains my effects as well. You can add other effects tracks like delays and pitch shifting things with modulation. You can go crazy with it as well. All right, next thing you want to do before you start recording is to check your metronome or click track settings. At the bottom of the screen, you have your tempo. If you click this button here and you know exactly what your tempo wants to be, instead of it being 105, I can click and type in 88. If I hit enter, I've now changed the tempo of my entire song to 88 beats per minute. You want to for sure have some sort of tempo set as soon as possible, because once you start recording tracks, it's very difficult to manipulate those tracks to get them locked into a metronome or click track. Even if you're just changing your tempo from like 77 to 78, that much of a difference will make your music sound pretty crazy. If you have your guitars recorded at 77 and your drums are recorded at 78, at some point they're going to diverge from each other and that will be a mess. You can also change the timing. So if you want this to say 3/4, if the song is in 3/4 instead of 4/4, you can change that there. You can change the key of the song. And then here above the word metronome, you have this metronome icon. Whenever it's blue, that means you should be hearing a click track in your ear. If that click track is too loud, make sure your mix window is open, and you can go right next to the metronome fader. You can click and drag this here and bring this down. As soon as I do, you'll hear that the metronome is much quieter. So here's our metronome now. And here it was before. So if your metronome click track, often if you're recording vocals or anything like that, you'll definitely need to know where your click track volume is. And if you want to change the sound of the click track, if you don't like the default stuff, click the little wrench tab above the word metronome. You can change the accent sound. You can change it to a beep. You can change it to a cowbell if you want to, like if this was just going to be a bunch of cowbells. Let's take a listen to that. Okay, so that is your click track. Make sure you got your tempo set. Make sure you got the sound that you want for your click track before you start recording. The next thing has to do with the arrangement of the song. So at the top of Presonus Studio One, above all of our tracks, you see this, what looks like a ruler. If I click within the ruler and I drag up, you'll see that it zooms out, so we're seeing more of the session. Then next to where it says add tracks, that little burger stack I mentioned earlier, you can open this up and go to Arranger. And then with the Arranger tab open, you can zoom in, and most songs you'll probably start maybe around measure 5. Give yourself a little bit of breathing room. If I double click anywhere in the Arranger section, that little horizontal bar, I can now have an arrangement of my song. But of course, you don't want to go intro, verse, chorus, bridge, outro. Okay, that would be a very short song, and each of these is only 1 measure long each. What I prefer to do as soon as possible, you may not know the arrangement of your song just yet, but I'll take this intro tab, and on the right side of the tab, I'll put my mouse so that I can click and extend how long the intro is. Then I zoom out of the song, and I'll try to guess the distance, like how long is this song going to be. If I'm 113 measures, let's try to get it right to 113. Then I'll zoom in, and instead of it being the intro for 113 measures, I hit 3 on my keyboard, which gives me a slice tool. Let's say I want my intro to be 4 measures long. If it's 4 measures long, I can count out 4 measures. I go to measure 9, I make a cut. Then let's say the verse of the song is going to be, let's go 8 measures. If I can do math. We'll do another 8 or so for the chorus. Then we'll do a little turnaround. Our next verse. Take the slice tool and chop this up as much as you want, okay? So you can make your arrangement that way. And of course, I don't want them to all say intro. So if I click on the word intro and then open up the inspector view, I can now rename any of these tabs. If I double click where it says intro right here, I can make this one say verse 1 and hit enter. Then after verse 1, we're doing a chorus 1, hit enter, double click here, we'll call this turnaround. Then we've got verse 2, then we've got chorus 2, and so forth. So as you can see, you can make this arrangement however, whatever's going to fit your song as soon as possible, because when you're recording and you're not sure where you're at in the song, that can be a huge time waster. Do chorus 4, and then we'll do outro. And the last thing when it comes to arrangement view is you can change the color of these tabs. So just to the left of wherever you've labeled the sections, if I click any of these regions, I can change this to yellow. So let's make the verses yellow. If I right click, yellow, let's make the choruses, so blue, let's make the choruses red. So all of my choruses kind of looks like McDonald's right now. I want my choruses to be red. And then maybe this last chorus, instead of it being red, I'm going to make it pink, because that's going to be a down chorus, for instance. Turn around, let's make the bridge something like a green. Okay, so now at the top of the screen, you can see an arrangement. And the reason this is going to save you time, as soon as you can make an arrangement for your song, when you're recording and you're just looking at a bunch of blobs on the screen, you really want to be able to jump around from chorus 3 to chorus 4. You may need to record a vocal on verse 2. Well, I can zoom in and I know that verse 2 is right there on measure 27. I know that the chorus 2 is starting on measure 35, and so forth. So that's the arrangement tool. Going along with the arrangement are your markers, okay? Markers are gonna involve things like your start and stop. So I go to that burger stack where I added the arranger, and let's add a marker tool. And with the marker tool, I can click and drag where it has the start. I'm gonna put it, let's put it a quarter note or so just before the intro. All right, so there is our start tab. To find the end tab, it's usually way far off over here. You can click and drag it. Instead of it being like measure 200 or so, I can add an end tab right here. That'll come in handy when you're exporting a song. You can either export a song using the loop region, or there's an option for export within the start and end markers. So you can create as many markers as you want. Essentially, it works similar to an arrangement, but you may want to put a marker for certain things like a drum fill or some sort of solo section is going to happen right here. You want to specifically say, hey, let's put a flag on that so we can go back and record later. You can add markers that way as well. If you just click the plus button, it says insert marker. You can add as many markers as you want. Like I was saying, if I go to the bridge section here, I can add a marker. Instead of it saying number 2, I want to say heavy drums. I think I misspelled that, but create as many markers as you want. Markers are kind of like highlighters or sticky notes that we're putting specifically within the arrangement. All right, the next step before you start recording is to add plugins. Now, this may not be for everyone. You may have a very unique way of mixing and you want to kind of be inspired in the moment, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to be adding things like EQ and compression. So you can save yourself a lot of time just by going to inserts on the mix tab, go to all of your tracks. You can highlight as many as you want. Let's highlight all of these tracks here at the same time. If I've got them highlighted and I click the inserts plus button, I can scroll down to Presonus Pro EQ, and it will add an instance of EQ to all of my tracks. I can add another instance of compression, and then after compression, let's add a fat channel. Fat channel's got a lot of really neat emulations of certain gear like the 1176, and the equalizers can make things like the EQP1A Pultec type stuff, so you can add fancy stuff there. You may not want to add these specific plugins, but go ahead and add the plugins that you want. And what you can also do, if you have all of the tracks selected, just above the track, next to where it says inserts, there's a little power button icon. If I hit this power button, it will disable all the plugins. The reason you may want to disable the plugins is you may not feel like using them, but when I go to mix, or if I'm recording the kick drum, for instance, and I want that kick drum to sound a little bit better, I can just enable that EQ plugin right there. I don't have to scroll through a bunch of menus, so it can save you a lot of time from scrolling through if you have presets already built. So if you want this kick drum to have some boosted low end, you want to cut some mud, and you want to brighten it up, you can have that set and ready, and then you can simply just disable it when you don't want to hear it. You can hear the original track, and then when you say, okay, let me hear a little bit of EQ on this kick drum, you can just enable it that way. Next thing you want to do before you start recording Presonus Studio One is save. Now, saving your progress, Presonus does a great job of having kind of a backup system. You can go into your settings and you can change how often that backup is happening. But for the most part, every time I've had Presonus Studio One crash on me, there's been some sort of backup that has saved me a lot of time. So I don't have to go back and re-record 50 things over and over. But get used to using the Control S key or function on your keyboard, or going up to File and clicking Save, okay? If you've already saved it, it'll be grayed out. You won't be able to save it again because you've not changed. But as soon as you change something, like if I click on this arrangement and I hit the delete key, now I can go up and save. Now it's saved that change. So make sure you're saving your progress as much as possible. Now, I know there's gonna be a lot of questions because we haven't actually recorded anything in this video, but I hope that's given you a few things to think of before you start recording in Presonus Studio One to get you up and running. Again, I've got videos linked in my description, or you can check out the channel for more stuff on recording your first song in Presonus Studio One, how to record drums, how to mix things like acoustic guitar and vocals. All that's on my channel, so please hit the like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.